Welcome to the Dark Chronicle. Tell us in the comments which country you're watching from and the time of day it is for you. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to catch every chilling tale. Zora ran as if the earth itself were burning her feet. The night swamp swallowed sound, yet the pounding of her heart thundered louder than the hounds behind her. Mud sucked at her ankles, roots clawed at her toes, and thorned vines tore at her dress, but she did not slow, she could not. Her baby clung to her back, wrapped tight in a strip of faded cloth, tiny fingers curled into her skin as if sensing the danger chasing them both. Behind her, torches flickered like angry stars between the trees. The dogs bayed, deep, trained voices that knew one thing and one thing only: hunt. White men shouted commands, their words sharp and cruel, cutting through the damp night air. They were close enough now that Zora could smell tobacco and sweat, close enough that one misstep would end everything. Only hours earlier, the plantation had still slept. Dawn had barely broken when the riders came crashing through the quarters. Hooves tore up dirt, whips cracked before anyone even stood. Zora had been nursing her child when the cabin door flew open. The overseer's eyes went first to the baby, then back to her face, and his smile had been slow and knowing. "They ran," he said, "you know where." She hadn't answered. Not when the slap knocked her sideways. Not when they dragged her outside. Not when they tied her wrists and laughed about how much her child would fetch downriver if she didn't learn to talk. It was another woman, old and bent, barely standing, who had caused the moment. She screamed, cursed them, spit at their boots. The overseer turned, annoyed. That single breath of distraction was all Zora needed. She twisted, slammed her shoulder into the man holding her, and ran. A rusted nail hidden in her palm cut the rope as she fled between cabins and into the trees beyond the fields. Now the fields were far behind her. The swamp had claimed her. Cypress trunks rose like ancient pillars, their roots breaking the water's surface in jagged shapes. Spanish moss dripped down, brushing her face like cold fingers. The moon was thin and weak, offering just enough light to show her where not to step, and not enough to make her feel safe. Zora knew this swamp. She had been born near it, raised on stories whispered at night, stories about people who vanished here, about hunters who never came back, about spirits older than chains. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, cracked but firm. "The swamp got ears," the old woman used to say, "and it don't listen to masters." Zora stumbled, nearly falling forward. Pain shot through her legs. Her breath came in ragged gasps now, her chest burning. She adjusted the cloth holding her baby, whispering soft words, half prayer, half apology. "Hush, my heart, hush!" The dog sounded closer. A gun fired. The shot split the night and bark exploded from a tree just ahead of her. Zora veered left, plunging into deeper water without thinking. Cold swallowed her calves, then her knees. Each step became a fight. The baby whimpered, a thin, frightened sound that cut straight through her. "No," Zora breathed. No, no, no. She forced herself onward, biting down a cry as something sharp sliced her foot. Blood mixed with swamp water. She tasted iron at the back of her throat. The dog's baying faltered. Zora noticed it all at once. The sound didn't grow louder anymore. It wavered, confused, overlapping with shouts of anger and frustration. A hunter cursed. Another shouted for the dogs to move. They didn't. Zora slowed just for a heartbeat, hiding behind the thick trunk of an ancient oak, its roots twisted outward like the ribs of something long dead. She pressed her back to it, every muscle screaming, and listened. The swamp had changed. The insects were gone. No frogs, no night birds. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if she were standing inside a held sigh. Her grandmother's stories came rushing back, not as memories but as warnings. Zora reached for the small pouch tied beneath her dress. Her fingers trembled as they closed around it. She had sworn never to use what was inside, had sworn she would survive without it. But survival had led her here, and here demanded truth. Inside the pouch were things passed down, hidden, protected. Graveyard dirt wrapped in cloth, a small bone charm smoothed by generations of hands. Red thread, faded but unbroken. The dogs whimpered now. Zora slid down to her knees beneath the oak. Mud soaked her dress. Her baby stirred, then went quiet, as if sensing something beyond fear. Zora pressed her forehead to the tree's roots and whispered the words her grandmother had taught her when the moon was dark and listening, words from across the ocean, words that did not belong to this land, but had claimed it anyway. The air shuddered. Behind her, a horse screamed, a hunter shouted, panic sharp in his voice. Another laughed nervously, then stopped laughing altogether. Zora did not look back. She didn't need to. She felt the swamp shift, felt its attention turn. Her breath slowed. For the first time since the chase began, Zora was not running. She tied the red thread around her wrist, tight enough to bite into skin, and pressed the bone charm into the mud at the base of the oak. Her blood, still flowing from her cut foot, dripped onto the roots. "I ain't asking for power," she whispered. "Only passage." The dogs fell silent, and the hunt as it had been ended there. Zora stayed kneeling long after the last sound of the dogs disappeared, her palm pressed flat against the cold, wet roots of the oak. The swamp did not rush back to life the way it should have. It lingered in that unnatural stillness, as if listening, as if deciding whether she was worthy of what she had asked. Her wrist burned where the red thread cut into her skin. With every heartbeat it felt tighter, heavier, as though it were no longer just thread but a promise binding flesh to something unseen. She cradled her child closer, feeling the slow rise and fall of his breath against her back. He was warm, alive. That alone kept her from collapsing entirely. A soft ripple spread across the black water nearby. Not wind, not an animal. The swamp moved with intention now. Zora forced herself to stand. Her legs shook violently, threatening to give way, but she leaned against the oak until the weakness passed. The tree felt different under her hand, no longer just bark and rot, but something solid, ancient, aware. She whispered her thanks without knowing to whom she spoke. When she took her first step away from the oak, the ground shifted subtly, as if easing her path. Roots that would have tripped her, moments before, seemed to pull back. Mud that had dragged at her feet now released her more easily. The swamp did not guide her like a road, but it no longer fought her either. Behind her, somewhere deeper in the trees, a man screamed. The sound cut short, swallowed so quickly it might never have existed at all. Zora flinched, her heart hammering, but she did not turn around. Her grandmother's voice returned, stern and clear. "Don't look back once you've been answered. Curiosity is how spirits collect their debts early." She moved forward, deeper into the swamp, following no visible trail. Fog crept low over the water, pale and thick, wrapping around her calves like living breath. Shapes formed at the edges of her vision, tall shadows that vanished when she tried to focus on them. She kept her eyes ahead, fixed on nothing and everything. Her body ached in places she could barely feel anymore. Her feet were torn raw, her shoulders burned from carrying her child for so long. Hunger gnawed at her, sharp and insistent, but fear still outweighed it. Fear and the strange, steady pull she felt in her chest, like an unseen hand guiding her onward. She thought of the plantation then, not with longing but with distance, as though it already belonged to another life. She remembered the fields at dawn, the overseer's shadow stretching long across the ground, the way her name had been spoken like something owned. Zora realized with a quiet shock that no one had called her name since she ran. In the swamp, she belonged only to herself. A lantern light flickered through the fog ahead. Zora froze instantly, her muscles locking, her breath caught halfway in her chest. Her mind screamed at her to run, to vanish, but her feet refused to move. The light swayed gently, too steady to be a hunter running, too slow to be searching. Then she heard footsteps, not splashing, not heavy. Soft, measured. A figure emerged from the fog, tall and thin, carrying the lantern low. For a heartbeat, Zora could see nothing but silhouette. Then the light lifted, and she saw the woman's face. It was not a white face. The woman's skin was dark, her hair wrapped in a faded cloth, her eyes reflecting the lantern glow like polished stone. She looked old and young all at once, her features sharp with knowledge, worn smooth by time. "You shouldn't stop moving," the woman said quietly. Her voice sounded like dry leaves brushing together. Zora's throat tightened. "I didn't know if you were real." The woman's mouth curved slightly. "Real enough for tonight." She turned without waiting, walking deeper into the fog. Zora hesitated only a second before following. Every instinct told her this woman belonged here, that refusing her would be far more dangerous than trusting her. They walked in silence for a long time. The fog thickened, closing in so tightly Zora could barely see her own hands. Yet the woman ahead never stumbled, never slowed. When Zora faltered, the ground seemed to lift her feet forward, as if unwilling to let her fall. "Dogs won't come past the oak," the woman said eventually. "Not tonight, not ever again." Zora swallowed. "What did I call?" The woman stopped and turned. Up close, her eyes were deep, endless, filled with something that looked like memory stretching back farther than any plantation ledger. "You didn't call," she said. "You remembered." The words settled into Zora's bones. A distant gunshot echoed, muffled and lost. Then shouting, angry, confused, edged with fear. The fog thickened further, swallowing the sound until it became nothing more than a dull vibration. "They lost," Zora whispered. "They stopped understanding where they were," the woman corrected. "That's worse." They reached a narrow rise of land, barely above the waterline. The woman motioned for Zora to sit. Zora lowered herself carefully, her legs finally giving out beneath her. She clutched her child, rocking him gently, tears slipping free at last. Silent, unstoppable, the woman knelt and examined Zora's foot without touching it. "You bled," she said. "I didn't mean to. It still counts." Zora nodded. She had known that deep down. Nothing given was ever taken lightly. "How much will it cost?" she asked. The woman met her gaze. "Not tonight, but someday you'll hear the swamp call your name. When it does, you'll answer." Fear flickered through Zora, but it was quieter than before, tempered by something else. Acceptance, perhaps, or understanding. The woman stood. "Rest while you can." Zora closed her eyes just for a moment. When she opened them again, the lantern light was gone. The fog had thinned slightly, revealing still water and dark trees. She was alone, yet she did not feel abandoned. Her child stirred, then slept again. Somewhere far behind her, men would wander in circles until dawn, until their confidence bled away, until the swamp finished teaching them how small they were. Zora rose and continued walking, guided by nothing she could name, carrying her future on her back, leaving the hunt buried in silence and fog. Zora walked until the fog thinned into a pale veil, and the swamp began to breathe again. The first sounds returned cautiously. Water insects skimming the surface, the distant plop of something slipping into the dark, a single night bird calling as if to test whether it was safe to speak. Her legs moved on habit now, one step after another, her body remembering motion even as her mind drifted between exhaustion and vigilance. She did not know how long she had been walking, only that the pull in her chest had shifted slightly, no longer urging her forward with urgency, but keeping her steady, alert. Behind her, the swamp had not released the men who chased her. They moved without order now, without the sharp certainty that had driven them hours earlier. Torches sputtered in the damp air, flames shrinking and flaring unpredictably. Horses stamped and snorted, their eyes rolling white as shadows slid across the water where no bodies moved. The dogs, trained, obedient, relentless, huddled together, refusing every command, their noses lifted not to track but to whine. One of the hunters cursed and yanked at a leash. The dog snapped, teeth flashing, not at the swamp but at the man holding it. "That ain't right," another muttered, scanning the trees. "Ain't natural." They had lost the trail. Worse, they could feel it watching them. The swamp pressed in closer with every step they took. Paths that should have led back toward higher ground bent inward, looping them deeper into black water and choking roots. Every landmark looked familiar until it wasn't. A fallen log appeared twice, then vanished entirely. A cypress stump seemed to move when no one was looking directly at it. Then the whispers began. At first they sounded like the wind threading through moss, easy to dismiss. But the words sharpened, shaping themselves into something recognizable. A man swore he heard his mother's voice calling his childhood name. Another heard laughter, soft female, close to his ear. "Stop that," one hunter barked, his voice tight. "Ain't nobody here but us." Something laughed again, farther away now, as if amused by the denial. A gun went off, the crack loud and desperate. Birds erupted from the trees in a sudden storm of wings. When the echo died, the swamp fell into a deeper silence than before, heavy and judging. One man began to pray. He whispered the words fast, stumbling over them, crossing himself again and again. His hands shook so badly the lantern rattled. He had grown up hearing stories of root women and swamp spirits, stories told to frightened children and slaves alike. He had laughed at them then. He wasn't laughing now. A scream tore through the night, high, sudden, ending in a wet, choking sound. The men spun toward it, torches swinging wildly. The light caught only ripples spreading across the water where a man had stood moments before. His hat floated, turning slowly. No blood, no struggle, just absence, Panic broke what little order remained. Horses were abandoned, reins dropped. One man ran blindly and fell into a sinkhole, his cries fading as the swamp closed over him. Another fired into the trees until his gun clicked empty, then sobbed when the shadows leaned closer instead of retreating. They began to whisper a word none of them wanted to say aloud. Hoodoo. Zora felt it when the first man vanished. A shiver ran through her, not fear but awareness. The red thread on her wrist tightened again, warm as fresh breath. She stumbled and caught herself against a tree, pressing her forehead to the bark until the sensation passed. She did not rejoice. She did not mourn. She understood. The woman with the lantern had spoken the truth. The men hadn't lost. They had stopped understanding where they were. Zora pushed on, guided now by faint breaks in the trees, by the subtle way the ground firmed beneath her feet. The swamp still watched her, but its gaze felt measured, assessing rather than threatening. She moved with care, mindful of the debt she carried, careful not to rush or demand. As dawn crept closer, the sky lightened to a dull grey. Fog clung low, reluctant to leave. Zora reached a narrow strip of higher ground, barely more than a spine of earth threading through water. She collapsed there at last, her body finally refusing to obey. Her child stirred and cried softly. Zora held him close, rocking, humming a tune her grandmother had sung, a song without words, meant to soothe spirits as much as babies. Her voice was hoarse but steady. When she closed her eyes, she dreamed. She stood in the swamp as it had once been, long before chains, long before torches. Women walked freely through the water, their skirts untouched, their feet finding ground where none should exist. They sang to the trees, braided roots with red thread, pressed bone charms into earth still warm with life. Among them stood her grandmother, younger than Zora had ever known her, her eyes bright with recognition. "Remember," the old woman said, "but don't forget yourself." Zora woke with a start, breath catching in her chest. The swamp was quiet, grey with morning. Her wrist ached. The red thread darkened, damp with sweat and something else she did not want to name. She rose slowly and continued. Behind her, the last of the hunters stumbled free of the swamp as the sun broke fully over the trees. His face was pale, his clothes torn, his eyes hollowed by terror. He dropped to his knees on dry land and vomited until nothing came up but bile. When he tried to speak, no sound came out. Later, when he was found wandering a road days away, he would write with shaking hands of a woman standing on the water, watching him without blinking. He would carve warnings into wood, refuse to sleep near trees, and scream when dogs barked in the night. No one would ever get a full story from him, and no one would ever hunt in that part of the swamp again. Zora did not know any of this. She walked on, carrying her child toward a future she could not yet see, leaving behind fear, blood, and the broken certainty of men who had believed the world belonged to them. The swamp closed gently behind her, keeping its secrets and remembering her name. Zora reached the edge of the swamp as the sun lifted higher, pale and uncertain, as if even daylight hesitated to claim this place. The trees thinned gradually, their roots loosening their grip on the earth, and the water retreated into narrow channels that whispered instead of swallowed. She paused there, standing between two worlds, the dark, breathing maze behind her and the open land ahead, flat and deceptively calm. Her legs trembled. When she tried to take another step, they buckled. She fell to her knees, clutching her child as the strength finally left her body. The ground here was firm, sandy, scattered with dead leaves. No mud pulled at her. No roots twisted around her ankles. The sudden absence of resistance felt almost wrong, like silence after a scream. For a long moment she simply breathed. Each breath hurt, scraped raw through her chest. Her feet throbbed, every cut and tear announcing itself now that fear no longer drowned out pain. Her wrist burned where the red thread remained, darkened and stiff, pressed so deeply into her skin it felt carved there. Zora untied it slowly. The thread resisted her fingers, tight and stubborn, and when it finally loosened, a sharp ache pulsed through her arm, traveling up to her shoulder and into her neck. She hissed softly, biting her lip. Beneath the thread, her skin was bruised in a perfect circle, the mark vivid and unmistakable. A reminder. She tucked the thread into her pouch, her movements careful, reverent. Whatever she had called upon was not finished with her, and she would not insult it by casting its sign away. Her child stirred again, fussing weakly. Zora checked him frantically, running her hands over his small body searching for injury. He was thin, hungry, frightened, but alive. When he latched onto her, she wept quietly, tears soaking into his hair as relief and exhaustion finally broke through the walls she had held up all night. The sun climbed higher, warming her skin, drying the damp from her clothes. Birds called openly now, bolder, as if the swamp's long night had passed for them too. Zora rested only as long as she dared. She knew better than to linger. Men might fear the swamp, but fear did not erase cruelty. It only redirected it. She rose again and walked. The land beyond the swamp was unfamiliar but not empty. Old paths cut faint lines through tall grass. Abandoned fences leaned crookedly, their posts rotting, wire half swallowed by earth. Zora followed these signs carefully, keeping low, moving from shadow to shadow. Every sound made her flinch, the crack of a branch, the distant call of a crow, the whisper of wind through reeds. By midday, hunger gnawed at her fiercely. She found wild berries near a stand of trees, tasted one cautiously, then ate a handful, wiping the juice from her fingers before touching her child again. She drank from a shallow stream, the water cool and clear, offering quiet thanks before moving on. As the sun dipped toward afternoon, she felt it again, that pull in her chest, subtle but insistent. Not toward danger this time, but toward memory. Her grandmother. Zora had not allowed herself to think of her fully since the night began. The old woman had died seasons ago, buried without ceremony, her body returned to the same soil that had fed her labor all her life. The master had allowed no markers, no prayers spoken aloud. But Zora had whispered the old words anyway, pressed her palm to the earth, and promised never to forget. Now, with each step away from the swamp, she felt that promise tighten. As night fell again, Zora found shelter in the hollow of a fallen tree, its massive trunk split and dry inside. She settled there, hidden from open view, and built no fire. The darkness felt different here, less watchful but still alert. She slept in fragments, waking at every sound, every shift of shadow. When she dreamed of roots. They twisted around her ankles, not to trap but to steady her. Voices murmured beneath the earth, not calling her back, but reminding her of what she carried: blood, memory. A name that no ledger had ever recorded correctly. Far behind her, on the plantation she had fled, the morning brought confusion, then fear. The overseer returned without his men. Only one staggered back days later, silent, eyes wide and unseeing, his hands stained with swamp mud he could not wash away. When pressed to speak, he shook violently, clawing at his throat as if something invisible tightened there. Eventually he scrawled broken words onto paper, his hand barely obeying him. She stood on the water. The trees moved. The dogs cried like children. No one mocked him. Search parties were sent at first, carefully, reluctantly, stopping at the swamp's edge. They found broken chains, trampled ground, abandoned rifles rusting already in the wet air. They did not go farther. Even the dogs refused, flattening their ears and whining when led toward the trees. The master raged, then grew quiet. Zora's name was spoken less and less, not because she was forgiven, but because she had crossed from property into something worse, something uncertain, something that unsettled sleep and crept into dreams. Back on the road, Zora walked north by instinct more than knowledge. She followed stars when clouds allowed, moss on trees when it didn't. Once she passed another escaped soul, a man hiding in a ditch, eyes hollow with fear. They stared at each other for a long moment, then moved on without words, understanding that survival did not always allow for companionship. Days blurred together, her body healed slowly. Cuts scabbed, bruises faded to yellow, but the mark on her wrist remained, dark and clear, refusing to disappear. Sometimes it throbbed softly, and when it did, Zora listened. She learned to pause when the sensation came, to observe, to wait. More than once, doing so saved her from stumbling into danger. One night, as she rested near a creek, she heard footsteps. Her heart slammed hard against her ribs. She gathered her child, silent and swift, slipping behind brush. The footsteps passed without stopping. Two men, speaking low, arguing about roots and rumors. One mentioned the swamp, his voice uneasy. They say something bad lives there now. Zora closed her eyes, breathing slowly, willing herself invisible. When the men were gone, she felt the tightness in her wrist ease. She understood then. The hoodoo had not ended in the swamp. It had bound itself to her, not as a weapon but as a witness. As long as she remembered who she was, as long as she did not deny what had carried her through the dark, it would walk with her, not to save her, but to ensure she was never entirely alone again. Zora pressed her lips to her child's forehead and whispered his name into the night. Ahead lay danger, hunger, and choices she could not yet see. Behind her lay a place that would remember her forever, and somewhere between the two, a mother walked forward, marked by the old ways, carrying both freedom and its price in her blood. The land changed again after that. The trees thinned into scattered stands, and the ground rose just enough to keep water from pooling at every step. Zora felt the shift immediately, not just under her feet but in the air. The swamp's heavy breath loosened its hold, replaced by something sharper, drier. The pull in her chest did not disappear, but it softened, becoming more like a quiet presence walking beside her rather than a hand guiding her back. Freedom, she realized, did not feel the way she had imagined. It was not light. It was not joy. It was vigilance. She moved mostly at night now, resting during the day when she could find cover. Her child had grown quieter, as if learning the rules of this new life without being told. When he cried, it was brief and sharp, then gone, his small body curling close to hers as though he understood silence could be protection. Zora learned the land as she went, which streams ran clear and which tasted wrong, which berries fed and which burned the tongue, which birds meant safety and which meant men nearby. The mark on her wrist pulsed now and then, warning her before her ears or eyes caught danger. Each time she listened. One night, as she followed a narrow trail worn thin by hooves and boots, she saw firelight ahead. She froze instantly, lowering herself into the brush, her child pressed tight against her chest. The fire burned low and careful, campfire light, not a lantern, not a torch. She counted shapes moving around it. 3 men. Not hunters, not like before. These men sat close, speaking softly, their weapons leaned within reach but not held. She could not hear their words, only their tone. Waiting. The mark on her wrist burned. Zora backed away inch by inch, her breath slow and measured. She circled wide, heart hammering, muscles screaming as she crawled through thorns and damp leaves. When she finally rose and put distance between herself and the fire, her legs nearly gave out. She did not stop walking until dawn. Later that day, she reached a small clearing where the earth had been disturbed. Freshly turned soil, clumsy and uneven. A grave. No marker, just a piece of wood shoved into the ground. Someone had scratched a name into it, the letters crooked and shallow. She did not know the name. Zora knelt anyway. She pressed her palm to the earth and whispered the old words. Not a call, not a bargain. Just acknowledgement. The air warmed slightly like a held breath released. When she stood, the pull in her chest shifted again, urging her onward. She was not the only one walking this road. That night, she dreamed of the lantern woman again. This time the woman did not stand in the swamp. She stood on dry ground, her feet bare, her dress clean. The lantern was gone. Her eyes, however, were heavier. "You're going too far to turn back now," the woman said. "I know," Zora answered. "You carry more than a child." Zora looked down at her wrist. "I didn't ask for it." The woman nodded. "None of us ever do. Will it leave me?" The woman's gaze softened. "When it no longer needs to remind you who you are." Zora woke before dawn, her wrist aching gently, not burning, almost like reassurance. Days later she reached a settlement of free black families tucked between forest and field. It was not marked on any map. It survived by being overlooked. Zora watched it from the tree line for hours before daring to approach. Smoke rose thin and careful. Children moved quietly. Men worked with eyes always lifting to scan the distance. When she finally stepped forward, hands empty and visible, an older woman met her halfway. "You running?" the woman asked. Zora nodded. "You carrying?" the woman asked, eyes flicking to the baby. "Yes." The woman studied her wrist. Her expression changed. Not to fear, not to anger, but to understanding. "Come on then," she said. "You can rest. Not forever, but long enough." Zora stayed 3 nights. They fed her, washed her wounds, wrapped her feet. No one asked where she had come from. No one asked what she had done. But the older women spoke quietly around her at night, their voices threading together stories Zora half recognized. Stories of swamps that swallowed cruelty, of women who walked out of darkness carrying children and something older still. On the third night, a man arrived breathless, fear sharp on his face. Riders, he said, 2, maybe 3. The settlement moved like a single body, fires doused, children hidden, paths erased. Zora felt the mark on her wrist flare once, stronger than it ever had before. The older woman gripped Zora's arm. "You can't stay." "I know." She did not argue, she did not plead. She had learned better than that. They pointed her toward a river farther north, a place where boats sometimes came quietly at night, carrying whispers of freedom farther than feet could travel. Zora thanked them with her whole body, pressing her forehead to the ground before leaving. She did not look back. As she walked, she felt the presence return more fully, not heavy, not demanding, but alert. When the riders passed her trail hours later, they did not see her. When they paused, uncertain, the wind shifted, carrying her scent away from them. When one horse spooked suddenly and refused to move forward, Zora did not smile. She simply kept walking. By the time she reached the river, she understood something clearly for the first time. The hoodoo had not followed her to punish those men. It had followed her because she was still moving. Because as long as she walked, as long as she chose life again and again, the old ways had purpose. She stood at the riverbank as moonlight rippled across dark water, her child warm and solid in her arms. Somewhere beyond this crossing lay danger of a different kind, fear shaped like laws instead of whips. Zora stepped closer to the water. Behind her, the land held its breath, not to stop her, but to watch her choose what came next. The river smelled different from the swamp. It carried iron and movement, old silt scraped from faraway places, the quiet promise that nothing here stayed still for long. Zora stood at its edge, toes sinking into cool mud, the water whispering against itself in low, restless voices. Moonlight stretched across the surface like a broken road, trembling with every current. This crossing felt heavier than the others. She held her child close, his small hand gripping her dress, as if he sensed the importance of this place. He was older now, only by days, but days that had stretched into something larger than time. His eyes opened wider, tracking light, sound, motion, alive in a way that made every sacrifice sharp and undeniable. Zora waited. She did not know for what, only that moving too soon would be wrong. The pull in her chest steadied, no longer urging her forward or warning her back. It simply existed, patient, aware. The mark on her wrist did not burn. It rested, dark and calm, like an eye closed but not sleeping. A sound drifted across the water, wood against wood, faint but deliberate. Zora crouched instinctively, slipping into shadow. The sound grew clearer, oars slow and careful. A low shape emerged from the darkness, barely visible against the river's skin. A boat, small, unglamorous, real. A man stood at the bow, his silhouette steady. He raised a hand, not waving, not calling. Waiting. Zora stepped forward. The man's eyes went first to the child, then to her face, then, briefly, to her wrist. He did not ask questions. He did not speak words of promise. He simply nodded once and guided the boat closer. When Zora stepped into it, the river rocked gently, testing her balance. She sat, clutching her child, as the man pushed off with practiced ease. The shore drifted away, shadows breaking apart, the land loosening its hold. Halfway across, Zora felt it, a shift, not in the water, not in the night, in herself, the presence that had walked beside her since the swamp stirred, not urgently, not possessively, but attentively. She closed her eyes just for a moment and let herself feel it fully for the first time. It was memory, not a spirit that demanded blood or fear, but the weight of those who had walked before her and refused to disappear quietly. Women who had run with children on their backs, men who had vanished into forests rather than bend, names erased from records but carved deep into earth and water. She was not carrying power. She was carrying remembrance. The boat touched the opposite shore. The man helped her out, pointing silently toward a narrow path that vanished into trees. Before leaving, he pressed something into her hand, a scrap of cloth folded tight. Inside was a direction, written in careful charcoal. Not a destination, just a way forward. Zora whispered her thanks. He was gone before she finished speaking. The land on this side felt different, not safer, not kinder, just quieter in a way that suggested watching rather than hunting. Zora followed the path until dawn, then rested beneath a stand of trees where the leaves whispered but did not accuse. When she woke, the mark on her wrist had changed. It had lightened slightly, no longer bruised dark but the color of old bark, blending more naturally into her skin. She touched it gently, unsure whether to feel relief or loss. She continued north. Weeks passed. Months. Zora moved through safe houses and hidden roads, across fields worked by hands like hers, through towns where freedom was spoken softly and danger wore polite clothes. She learned new names, learned when to speak and when to disappear, learned that escape did not end fear, it taught you how to live alongside it. Her child grew stronger, louder, curious. He laughed once, sudden and bright, and Zora dropped to her knees in shock, tears spilling freely as she buried her face in his neck. That sound felt like a victory the world had not prepared her for. Sometimes, at night, she dreamed of the swamp. Not the chase, not the terror, the oak tree, the fog, the feeling of being seen and not rejected. In those dreams, the lantern woman stood at a distance, watching without expression. She never spoke again. She didn't need to. Years later, people would whisper about a stretch of southern swamp, where dogs refused to track and men lost their way. They would say a woman lived there once, that she had called something old and never gave it back. Some would say she became part of the land. Others would swear she escaped north carrying a child and a curse. Both stories would be true in their own way. Zora never returned to the swamp. She did not need to. The old ways loosened their hold as her life filled with new meaning. The mark on her wrist faded further with time, becoming little more than a shadow, then a memory. But it never vanished completely. On certain nights, when danger passed too close, when footsteps lingered where they should not, Zora would feel a familiar tightening in her chest. And always, she would listen. She taught her child the stories when he was old enough to understand them, not as warnings, not as spells, but as truths. Remember who you come from, she told him. Remember who carried you when the world didn't want you breathing. And he did, years later, when he stood taller than her, when his voice carried strength instead of fear. He asked her once if the stories were real. Zora looked out at the night, at the trees swaying gently, at the road stretching forward into uncertainty. Yes, she said softly, they're real. She did not explain further. Some things lived best unspoken. Some debts were paid simply by surviving. And somewhere deep in the roots of an ancient swamp, the land remembered a mother who ran, a child who lived, and a choice that changed the shape of the dark forever.